Berlin 1931. A cold wind blows across a silent street as a line of unemployed men stretches past the corner bakery. Their hands are in their pockets, their eyes fixed on the ground, and behind them stands a bank with its doors locked shut. On the glass, someone has pressed a handprint. It is fading, but the desperation is not. If you want to understand why World War II happened, do not start with Hitler. Do not start with ideology. Start here in front of a bankrupt bank in a city where people have lost their savings, their jobs, and their sense of the future. Because long before tanks crossed borders, a financial equation was collapsing from inside. Germany was trapped in a system where debt was greater than production, where interest grew faster than hope, and where every payday felt like a countdown to something no one could name, but everyone could feel. This is the story of how a global financial arrangement written on paper in 1919 pushed an entire nation toward breaking point, and how, when the numbers stopped adding up, the world slipped toward its deadliest war. The story truly begins in 1919 inside the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. Politicians celebrated the end of the Great War, but they were also creating the most dangerous balance sheet in modern history. Germany was handed a debt of 132 billion gold marks, a number so large that it lived outside economic reality. It was a punishment disguised as a payment plan, and it rested on an assumption that would destroy everything that came after that Germany could somehow pay. But the problem was not only the number, it was what Germany had left to pay with. The treaties stripped the country of the coal that powered its factories, the steel that built its bridges, and the farmland that fed its people. 15% of coal output vanished. 10% of steel. 13% of agriculture. It was as if a company had been fined more than its annual revenue after losing its best employees and most of its equipment. The bill was impossible from the start, and yet the Allies insisted the math would work. They did not understand, or perhaps did not care, that debt cannot be repaid when the engine of production has been dismantled. A nation's ability to pay is not measured by the size of its punishment, but by the strength of its factories, its labor force, and its ability to generate value. Inside Germany, the consequences were immediate. Taxes rose. Prices climbed. Factories slowed. People watched their savings disappear. A young couple who dreamed of buying a home found that the money they had stored for years now bought only a loaf of bread. A shop owner, who once sold goods from 3 suppliers, could now barely afford one. And every month the weight of reparations pushed the country deeper into a financial hole. This was the Versailles trap, a structure that guaranteed collapse. The victors had not created peace. They had created a ticking clock. Germany was expected to pay more than it could ever produce, and every year that passed pushed the country closer to a breaking point. But instead of easing the pressure, the world's bankers offered a different solution. Not forgiveness, not restructuring based on productivity. They offered loans. And that is where the next chapter of this crisis begins. By the mid-1922s, it had become clear to everyone that Germany could not pay reparations through production. The factories were too weak, the economy too damaged, and the tax base too broken. Yet Britain and France needed German money to pay their own war debts to the United States. If Germany stopped paying, the entire financial chain would collapse. So the world's bankers engineered a new mechanism. Not to solve the problem, but to keep the payments flowing. It was called the Dawes Plan. Under this arrangement, American banks poured massive loans into Germany. The money was not meant to rebuild German society or restore its industries. It had one purpose: to fund the reparations Germany owed to Britain and France. Those countries in turn used that money to repay the loans they had taken from the United States during the First World War. Money moved in a perfect circle. United States to Germany. Germany to Britain and France. Britain and France back to the United States. Everyone claimed the system was working, but nothing real had changed. Germany was not paying reparations from its own strength. It was borrowing from American banks to keep the illusion of solvency alive. It was as if a household paid its mortgage using one credit card, then used another credit card to pay off the first. The balance sheet looked fine on paper, but the debt burden was growing heavier with every rotation. Then came the Young Plan in 1929. It lowered the total amount of reparations but stretched the payments across nearly 6 decades, all the way to 1988. Generations not yet born were already in debt. It was a financial structure without an end, designed not just to extract payment, but to maintain control. Foreign advisors monitored Germany's budget. Customs, revenue, and transportation systems were pledged as collateral. Even the central bank operated under outside supervision. Germany had lost its sovereignty not through military conquest but through a spreadsheet. In 1930, the next piece of this architecture was constructed, the Bank for International Settlements. On the surface, it was designed to coordinate global payments. In reality, it was the first institution that sat above national governments, able to move money quietly and efficiently across borders. It ensured that no matter how unstable Europe became, the flow of debt service would continue. For a few years, the system held. American loans fueled German payments, and German payments fueled the debts of Britain and France. Everyone depended on everyone else, but the balance was fragile. It relied on only one thing: American credit. As long as the loans kept coming, the world stayed afloat. But in October 1929, Wall Street collapsed. The source of global liquidity evaporated almost overnight. And when the American loans stopped, the entire machine began to fall apart. When the American credit engine died in 1929, the entire financial structure built after World War I collapsed with it. Germany had never been paying reparations through real growth. It had been borrowing its way through each deadline. Without new loans, the numbers no longer worked. And when the numbers failed, society followed. Banks in Berlin, Hamburg, and Cologne shut their doors. Industrial production fell by nearly half. Unemployment, which had been 1.3 million only months earlier, soared to more than 6 million. Factories that once roared with machinery now echoed with silence, their smokestacks cold against the winter sky. Families that had survived the horrors of the First World War now faced a new enemy, a financial collapse that took everything without firing a single shot. Middle-class households, once stable and proud, found their savings gone. A shopkeeper might open his drawer and discover that the money he had set aside for decades was no longer enough to buy a small bag of coal. A clerk who had never missed a day of work was suddenly dismissed with no hope of finding another job. This pain did not begin in 1929. It was the second blow in a decade of economic violence. In 1923, Germany had been consumed by hyperinflation. People carried banknotes in baskets. Children played with them like toys. A lifetime of savings could not buy a loaf of bread. Then the pendulum swung in the opposite direction. By 1930, prices were falling, and wages were collapsing. It was a deflationary spiral so severe that businesses closed even when their products were cheaper than ever. A population cannot endure both extremes without breaking. Confidence died. Trust died. The middle class, the backbone of any stable nation, dissolved under the weight of chaos. And in that vacuum, something darker began to rise. Political moderates could offer no solutions. The old establishment looked powerless. Every speech, every promise, every plan seemed small compared to the suffering in the streets. People no longer asked what was reasonable. They asked what was left to believe in. That was the moment when extremism stopped being a fringe idea and began to look like a path out of misery. And in the shadows of collapsing banks and silent factories, a man with fierce ambition and a simple message stepped forward. He promised order. He promised strength. He promised to make Germany whole again. The next chapter begins with him, but his rise was not a mystery. It was the inevitable consequence of a society cornered by economic ruin. By 1930, Germany was not choosing between political parties anymore. It was choosing between collapse and whoever claimed they could stop it. Factories had closed. Banks had failed. The old government had lost credibility. And in this landscape of despair, Adolf Hitler did not rise because people suddenly believed in his ideology. He rose because he spoke to a nation that had been economically shattered and emotionally stripped of hope. But there was another force behind his ascent, one that operated far from the rallies, far from the speeches, far from the crowded beer halls. It was the quiet but powerful engine of German industry. Companies like IG, Farben-Krupp, and Thyssen did not support Hitler because they shared his worldview. They supported him because they feared bankruptcy more than dictatorship. He offered stability. He promised to weaken labor unions, restore order, and revive the industrial base. For corporate leaders watching their empires crumble, he looked less like a radical and more like a solution. Yet the revival of German industry required more than domestic support. It needed capital technology and machinery. And despite the rise of Nazism, foreign money continued to flow into Germany. American corporations played a much larger role than most people realize. General Motors, through its German subsidiary Opel, modernized the production of trucks used by the German army. Ford expanded its operations supplying vehicles and industrial tools. IBM, through its subsidiary Dahomag, provided punch card machines that made large-scale data management possible. And Standard Oil worked with IG Farben on chemical research that would become essential to Germany's synthetic fuel program. This was not part of a conspiracy. It was market logic. Capital flows to opportunity. And in the early 1930s, Germany was a country rebuilding its industrial engine under a leader who promised growth at any cost. Meanwhile, the Bank for International Settlements continued to function as a global clearing center. Even as European politics grew tense, the BIS moved money quietly between central banks. It was designed to exist above the turbulence of nations, and it did. In a world inching toward conflict, it remained a place where financial interests were protected, regardless of ideology. Hitler's rise was not only a political event, it was an economic event. It was the product of industrial fear, foreign investment, and a nation desperate for a return to normalcy. He took the economic collapse and turned it into a mandate. He took the despair of millions and turned it into a source of power. And with every factory reopened and every job restored, his hold on Germany tightened. But the system that had lifted him up had not been fixed. It had simply been redirected. Germany now had an economy built for one-purpose rearmament, and a nation built for rearmament does not stay within its borders for long. The next chapter begins when Germany moves from rebuilding its economy to reshaping the map of Europe. By the late 1930s, Germany was no longer simply rebuilding, it was accelerating. The factories that once produced consumer goods were now producing steel ammunition, chemicals, and military vehicles. Roads were extended, railways expanded, unemployment fell. To many Germans it looked like a miracle. But beneath the surface, the engine powering this recovery was dangerously simple. The economy was not being repaired, it was being weaponized. Germany's rearmament program consumed enormous resources. It required iron, coal, oil, rubber, and food. Yet Germany did not possess enough of these materials within its own borders. No matter how efficient its factories were, the nation could not sustain a modern military without reaching outward. Expansion was not a political impulse. It was an economic calculation. When Germany marched into Czechoslovakia and later into Poland, it did more than take territory. It seized mines, factories, railroads, farms, and banks. It took control of entire national economies. Occupied countries were forced to finance their own occupation. In France alone, these costs exceeded hundreds of millions of marks every year. And the excess did not stay in Paris. It flowed directly to Berlin, helping Germany pay for its military operations and service its internal debts. It was an old pattern seen in ancient empires. When a state cannot generate enough value within its borders, it turns outward to extract resources from others. War becomes a financial tool. Conquest becomes a revenue stream, and for a time the numbers appear to work. But Germany was not the only nation transformed by economics during the war. Across the Atlantic, the United States was becoming the world's new financial center. Through the Lend-Lease program, America extended more than $50 billion in credit to its allies. Britain, which had once ruled an empire, was now borrowing to survive. Every ship, every tank, every box of ammunition delivered across the ocean deepened Europe's dependence on American finance. By 1943, the structure of global power had shifted. Germany relied on the economies it conquered. Britain relied on the loans it received. And the United States sat at the center of a system where both victory and survival depended on American credit. This transformation did not happen on the battlefield. It happened in ledgers, contracts, and shipping manifests. Money had reshaped the world long before any treaties were signed. And while the war raged in Europe and Asia, a group of delegates gathered at a quiet hotel in New Hampshire to design what would come next. They were not planning military campaigns. They were planning a financial order that would outlast every general and every government. The next chapter begins at Bretton Woods, where the modern world was born not through conquest but through currency. In July 1944, as cities burned and armies clashed across Europe and the Pacific, representatives from 44 nations gathered at the Mount Washington Hotel in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. The location was calm, almost idyllic. But the purpose of the meeting was anything but peaceful. The world was preparing for the end of the war, and with it, the end of the old financial order. The delegates understood something that most people did not yet see. The war had already decided who would emerge as the center of global finance. Gold reserves had drained from Europe. The British Empire had borrowed heavily. Germany and Japan were facing total collapse. Only one nation remained, with the resources, stability, and industrial strength to anchor a new system: the United States. Bretton Woods was not simply a conference. It was a reset. A chance to rewrite the rules that governed currencies, trade, and international payments. And the design reflected American dominance. The US dollar was placed at the center of the new structure. Every major currency would be pegged to it, and the dollar itself would be convertible into gold at a fixed rate of $35 per ounce. This made the dollar not just a national currency, but the foundation of world trade. Countries no longer needed to accumulate gold. They needed dollars. Two new institutions were created: the International Monetary Fund, which would oversee exchange rates and provide emergency loans, and the World Bank, which would finance reconstruction and development. Both institutions were headquartered in Washington, both relied on American capital, and both ensured that the United States would guide the financial recovery of Europe and Asia. To many nations devastated by war, this system offered stability. It promised predictable exchange rates, access to credit, and a path toward rebuilding. But it also placed them in a debt relationship with the United States. Every loan, every project, every reconstruction plan deepened America's role as the world's indispensable creditor. The scale of this influence became even clearer with the Marshall Plan. Announced in 1947, it provided $13 billion to Western Europe. Although often described as aid, most of it came with conditions. European markets had to open to American goods. Local industries had to accept American investment. And governments had to align their policies with the new financial order. West Germany, which had been crushed after World War I, was rebuilt with American support because U.S. policymakers understood a critical lesson. A stable Germany was more profitable than a broken one. Debt needed to be manageable, not punitive. When a debtor collapses, the creditor loses. When a debtor recovers, the creditor gains for decades. This was the opposite of Versailles. Instead of punishing Germany, the post-war system integrated it. Instead of demanding unpayable reparations, it offered structured credit. Stability produced loyalty. Productivity produced returns. By the early 1950s, the shape of the new world was clear. The United States controlled the global reserve currency. It dominated international lending, and it managed the institutions that would shape the financial decisions of nations for generations. World War II had ended on the battlefield, but the future had been decided at Bretton Woods. When the guns fell silent in 1945, the world believed the war was over. Cities could be rebuilt, borders could be redrawn, armies could return home. But one thing did not end. The debts created by years of conflict continued to shape the lives of nations long after the treaties were signed. Britain, once the world's greatest creditor, had borrowed so heavily through the Lend-Lease program that it would not finish repaying the United States until 2006. Germany, whose reparations had set the stage for crisis after World War I, made its final payment for those debts in 2010, 92 years after the armistice. And Japan, shattered by war and occupation, rebuilt its economy under an American financial umbrella that defined its trajectory for decades. The Cold War extended the pattern even further. Two superpowers faced each other across continents, but the true struggle was economic. The United States financed an enormous military machine through bonds, taxes, and global lending. The Soviet Union strained to match this pace, borrowing from Western banks to buy grain technology and industrial equipment. It was not defeated on the battlefield. It simply went bankrupt. The cost of competing with a dollar-based credit system was greater than its economy could bear. The same logic appeared again in 2008. The global financial crisis caused by reckless lending and speculative risk ended not with the collapse of the banks responsible, but with taxpayer-funded bailouts. Governments took on the burden. Citizens absorbed the costs, and the institutions that had engineered the disaster emerged larger, stronger, and more central than before. This pattern is not an accident. It is a feature of the modern financial world. Debt is not just a number. It is leverage. It is control. It is the invisible thread that binds nations, companies, and individuals into a system where failure is transferred downward and power is concentrated upward. And today, the structure created after World War II is under pressure once again. The United States carries a national debt measured in tens of trillions. Interest payments alone exceed the budgets of entire government departments. Rising powers like China are building alternative financial networks. Countries in Asia, the Middle East, and South America question the dominance of the dollar. In every corner of the world, strained budgets and rising borrowing costs test the resilience of economies. The same forces that once pushed Germany toward despair now emerge in new forms. Middle classes around the globe are squeezed by inflation. Nations struggle to pay their bills. Political extremism grows in the shadow of economic fear. The lesson of the 20th century is repeating itself. When debt grows faster than productivity, when ordinary people lose confidence in the future, and when global credit systems reach their breaking point, history does not stand still, it shifts. And those shifts rarely happen peacefully. We are still living in a world shaped by the financial consequences of past wars, and we are moving toward a future shaped by the debts of today. If there is one truth hidden beneath the wars, treaties, and political speeches of the last century, it is this: history moves to the rhythm of finance. Nations rise when their productive power expands. They fall when their debts outrun their capacity to pay. Everything else, from ideology to diplomacy, bends to that quiet, unforgiving mathematics. World War II was not only the product of hatred, nationalism, or the ambition of one man. It was the final chapter of a financial system that had been cracking for decades. The Versailles reparations weakened Germany's industrial core. The circular debt machine of the 1920 seconds kept the illusion of stability alive. The crash of 1929 broke the system open, and in the chaos that followed, extremism filled the void. But the war did more than destroy. It reset. Through Bretton Woods, the United States established a global order where the dollar became the backbone of international trade and American credit became the lifeline of recovery. Europe rebuilt. Japan recovered. West Germany transformed into an economic powerhouse. Yet all of this happened inside a structure designed by debt, shaped by debt, and maintained through debt. The pattern continued into the Cold War, the energy crises, the financial crash of 2008, and the modern geopolitical tensions of today. Every chapter in this story returns to the same question: who controls the flow of money? Who decides the rules of credit? And who pays the price when the system fails? The world we live in now is not shaped by the victory of armies, but by the victory of a financial architecture built in the mid-20th century. Borders matter. Politics matter. But nothing has proven more enduring than the institutions, currencies, and debt structures that emerged after World War II. And so we must ask ourselves, as we watch nations struggle under rising debt, as we see political anger grow from economic pain, and as new financial alliances emerge across continents, are we approaching another turning point, another moment, where the numbers no longer add up? If history teaches anything, it is that when debt becomes unsustainable, when productivity stalls, and when societies lose faith in the future, the world shifts. Sometimes slowly, sometimes violently. The past century showed us what happens when financial pressures reach their breaking point. The next century will reveal whether we have learned from it, or whether we are preparing to repeat the same pattern under different names and different flags. This is not just a story about World War II. It is a story about the forces that shape nations, the fragility of economic systems, and the quiet power of debt to drive events far beyond the control of any single leader. It is a story still being written,